Preacher and writer John Ortberg, in his book, When the Game is Over, It All Goes Back into the Box, tells a modern version of the parable of Bigger Barns. He talks about a CEO of a Fortune 500 company that was a startup, and after years, hours and upon hours, weeks after weeks of 90, 100, 120 hours a week this guy was putting in, his company was just taking off and expanding. What started in the United States was now multinational, huge corporate conglomerate. And as he came home and told his wife about a new opportunity of a merger, this time, this is really going to set us for good. We can retire early, we can have everything we want, it's just going to take a little more sacrifice. And how many times has she heard this elevator speech, watched him rationalize quantity of time isn't as important as the quality of time, spending with the kids as they forget and grow more and more distant from their dad. How many nights did she invite him to come up to go to bed, and at 10, 11 at night, no, I've still got just a few more things to do in the office, and go down and work. And their marriage had suffered over the time. Yes, they were getting bigger and better, and more international recognition. And boy, this deal was a sweetheart of a deal, hundreds of millions of dollars. But at what price? The man goes down late at night, wife goes to bed alone, which has become their habit, and begins typing at his computer. And as he's envisioning and taking care of all these emails and correspondences, all these people who work underneath him, all this control, all this power that he has, but a capillary going into his heart squeezes, and his heart skips a beat. And then another. And then he clutches at his chest, and in a moment of crystal clear clarity, as the scenes of his life flash before his eyes, he collapses there at his workstation in his house. At 3 a.m., his wife wakes up. The other side of the bed is still cold. She says, I can't believe it. He's still going. Pads down to his office, where she finds him and calls the EMS, and they're too late. People come in from all over the world. People are business associates, people in the community. He was a great philanthropist. People talk at his funeral at the cemetery as the priest speaks words about his innovation and his ability, his business savvy. And on his memorial, on his gravestone, a life spent with great success. As the cars go away and people drive back to their homes, as dusk settles upon the cemetery, a messenger of God, an angel, comes to the stone. And above the word success writes in a divine finger, fool. Fool. The first reading that Amy read today from the book of Ecclesiastes. I don't know if you've read the book of Ecclesiastes recently. You should. It's great. It's a fantastic book. Do you ever wonder about the meaning of life? Why am I here? Wrestle with God about, am I doing the thing that I was made to do? Is there something else I should be doing with my life? And through this book of wisdom, this beautiful book of Hebrew wisdom, the writer, the teacher, talking to his son, the young prince, starts off by saying, first I poured myself in trying to search for meaning, trying to search for purpose. I poured myself into learning. And I went and I read volumes. I read books and I went and I tried to gain as much wisdom as I could. And there's this beautiful passage in Ecclesiastes 2 that says, with the more wisdom I got came more sorrow. I'll let that sit there as I realized the ways things work in the world. And he said, that didn't fill me. It was like chasing after the wind. The more I knew was great, but it still wasn't enough. And so he kind of goes on this hedonistic Vegas-style lifespan where he's living in the fast lane and going in all these shallow relationships and one-night stands and all these things. And he says, I live this very fast-paced, desire-driven, do whatever I want life to make me feel good. And that, at the end of the day, when I looked at myself in the mirror, was like chasing after the wind. That was empty, hollow, shallow. And so I began to pour myself into career. I built things. I built these vast building projects. I acquired wealth. I invested, and I built and built until I was really secure financially. But even that, though I had plenty, at the end of the day, my soul felt empty, like chasing after the wind. And that book of Ecclesiastes, in what Amy read today, he said, I acquired all this stuff, but then I realized, just like anybody else, I'm going to die someday. Don't know when, but tomorrow isn't promised. And he said, and whoever succeeds me, whether it's a kid from my family or it's a distant relative, maybe they didn't work at all to acquire what I've acquired. And then what? There are no U-Hauls that follow the hearse. So all this stuff, for what? And it got me to thinking, if you didn't come to service today, or at home, and God knocked on your door and said, hey, listen, I know you've got things planned today, but I called it all in. You and I are just going to have breakfast this morning, and we're going to sit down and talk. And God said to you, just, hey, how's it going? How are you living the life that you've been given? Where is your priorities? Where are your priorities? What's driving you and your time and energies? Would there be a lot of stammering? Maybe a lot of excuses? How would we answer that in this moment? Paul, in his letter to Timothy, and it's something Paul talks a lot about in his letters, about contentment. There's this beautiful passage in Philippians as well. I've learned what it is to be content, whether I've been without or I've had plenty, whether I've been in a state of wealth or in a state of poverty. I've found what it is to be content in all things. He starts talking about contentment, spiritual contentment, and being able to recognize the blessings that we do have in a day. And then he puts in there a warning. Be careful, my young protege, about all kinds of greed, the dangers of pursuing wealth and riches, because they can derail you into thinking that it's all about you and your efforts, and your stuff becomes your God and your security, and you forget about others, and you forget about God, and it can poison your spirit. And he says that beautiful line at the end. Instead, live a life that really is life. Did you catch that at the end? Live a life, and the Greek for that is Zoe, abundant life. It's a divine living. It's not just getting up in the morning. There used to be an old Dunkin' Donuts commercial, time to make the donuts. You remember this? You get up at like 4 in the morning and be like, time to make the donuts. And it's going through the motion of the daily, rat race of task, earn, success. And instead, saying, hey, there's more to life than the almighty dollar. Think about your relationships. Think about your time and how you spend it with each other. The gift of a day. Be rich in those ways. Jesus is talking to a crowd of people, and he is interrupted in a rather rude way, in my opinion. We don't know what Jesus was teaching about per se, other than a guy says, excuse me, Rabbi, my brother, my father just died, and he's not giving me my portion of the inheritance. Will you come with me and talk some sense into them? Not that any of you have ever had a moment with family when somebody's died, and then they've come in. Maybe a brother or sister is caring for a mom or a dad or a loved one, and some distant cousin who hasn't been there for 20 years shows up and says, hey, when's the will being read? What are they doing with that old Mustang that they restored in the... Am I in there somewhere? And the vultures circling? I mean, this guy's not a bad guy. He's just asking a question, right? And she says, hey, I'm not an arbiter. I'm not a judge over estates. Let me tell you a story. A farmer has a bumper crop, bigger than he's ever had. In the Lorax, he's biggering and bettering. And he says to himself, it's this beautiful Greek monologue, the soliloquy, where as readers or listeners to the gospel, we hear it, but it's exaggerated. He says to himself, Self, I've got all these crops. What should I do? I know. I'll tear down these barns. I mean, this is crazy, right? I'll tear down these barns and I'll build bigger barns so that I can hold everything I've got. And then I'll say to my soul, did you catch this? Soul, now I've got enough to last me, set for life. And Jesus, in that moment, as he tells a story to this man who wants to get his at the death of a loved one. We don't know what the relationship was there, but we know where he's upset, that he's feeling left out. Be careful. Be careful about all kinds of greed, what your life priorities are, what you're after in life. And in Luke's gospel, one we're studying in 2 weeks, come on out, the gospel writer talks about endangerment of wealth and materialism putting us in the spiritual red, overheating that spiritual engine. 1 in every 10 verses of that gospel is about how we orient our lives towards God versus towards stuff. I don't know about you, but in my opinion, navigating spiritual life in America today, where so much is material, so much is about our stuff, this is a really poignant text. Let me give you an example. In the 1960s, there was no storage industry. But if anybody watched Storage Wars, Daryl Sheets, Dave Hester, yep. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Today, because we don't have places to put our extra stuff, there are almost 40,000 storage companies in the United States today to put our extra stuff. $15 billion industry, because we didn't know what it was yesterday, but we got to have it today. He says, be careful. Be careful about all your stuff, because you can lose sight of it, and your possessions can end up possessing you spiritually. And you can get rich in life, but be really poor in spirit. A contemporary pastor who served at Willow Creek Church, big one here in Chicago, talked about 2 funerals they had. He said the first was for Larry Clark. Larry was a volunteer in their couples ministry, their small group ministry. Larry was in his early 30s. Because he had read things in the Gospels, he had sold his home, lived in a one-room efficiency, and devoted his life. This is pretty radical change. He volunteered for the church full-time, no pay. And what he would do is try to encourage people, have conversation with people. He would go dumpster diving behind the supermarket for packaged and yet not fully spoiled foods and take them to pantries, like some of you do. And they went up to a church retreat in Milwaukee, and he was out jogging one morning and was struck by a car and killed. The pastor said at Willow Creek, which is a big church if you've ever been there, in the chapel where they normally hold the memorials, they can seat about a couple hundred. He said that there was almost a mile long of people waiting to come to Larry Clark's wake. 3 hours some people waited to talk to family that he had remaining. They moved his service to the auditorium. Again, a man without a car, without a house, who lived his life for others. He said within a couple of years of that service, Armand Hammer died. Many of you probably heard of Armand Hammer. He was the CEO and founder of Occidental Oil Petroleum Company, multinational, multi-million-dollar company. One of Fortune's 500's top. Very successful, very wealthy man. But in the year before several years before he died, The Secret Life of Armand Hammer, a book was written. And the author talked about how Hammer had a very distant relationship with his own son, how he had an illegitimate relationship with an affair with one of his wives, and the daughter from that affair he hid himself from and never acknowledged her existence. When his brother died, he challenged the will so that his brother's children and wife, who was nursing home bound, received nothing from his brother's estate. He fired a lot of his staff in a very dismissive and rude way, and at his funeral, none of his family came. The only people who were there to carry him to his grave were his hired chauffeur, butler, and paid staff who were paid to be there. He said, 2 men, very different priorities. Which one was rich towards God? It's just stuff. As I think about these texts, and I read things like, we come into this world naked, and naked we go out to it, it always brings me back to that old Cosby show where he says, you're my kids, and I brought you in this world, and I can take you out. But in all honesty, I think about life and my own priorities, the blessings we have. None of us is promised tomorrow. And I think, what really shapes a life when it all does go back in the box and we have a memorial service and people are gathered to remember us and the things they share, the memories they have. And it's always about the time and the connection that we share. The beauty of knowing a person and who they are. Ways they've taught us something. Ways they've touched us in some way that has made an impact in our lives. Nobody rarely talks about a car or a house, or it might be from a memory of something funny that happened or something that sticks in their mind, but it's never about the stuff at the end of the day. And so Jesus says, be careful. Be careful, my brothers and sisters. Everything else seems like chasing the wind. Where is it that really makes a life that is really life? if we're sitting down at the table with God today. Amen.